Hi, today we're going to talk about history. Not what happened, but why it happened. In the first episode, we said something simple but uncomfortable. Empires didn't exist because they were big, heroic, or advanced. They existed because power learned how to stay in one place without falling apart. Now, we need to go one step further. Because if empires were truly that powerful, there's a question we can't avoid anymore. Why didn't they appear everywhere? Why do we keep seeing the first empires rise in the same regions, around the same rivers, under similar conditions? This isn't coincidence. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Most people experience history through events, wars, leaders, dates, victories, collapses. But empires don't begin with events. They begin with geography. If you want to understand why empires emerge, you have to stop looking at timelines and start looking at maps. A map quietly explains what history later dramatizes. It shows where people can live, where food can be grown, where resources can be moved, and where large populations can be sustained. More importantly, it shows where surplus exists. Empires are not born in scarcity. They are born where there is more than enough. When you look at the earliest empires, one element appears again and again: water. Rivers are not just sources of drinking water. They represent predictable agriculture, transportation routes, trade networks, and continuity. A river that floods regularly teaches people rhythm. They learn when to plant, when to harvest, when to store. Over time, this predictability creates planning, and planning creates control. Control is the foundation of every empire. The first empires didn't rise because they were more intelligent than others. They rose because they were fed. Surplus food changes everything. It means not everyone has to farm. Some people can become soldiers. Some can become administrators. Some can keep records. Some can enforce rules. Surplus creates specialization, and specialization creates systems. Once a society begins recording information, who owns what, who owes what, who belongs where, power stops being personal and becomes structural. That is the moment an empire truly begins to exist. This also explains why empires didn't emerge everywhere humans lived. Mountains fragment authority. They break populations into smaller, harder-to-control groups. Deserts lack continuity and stability. Dense forests provide invisibility, making people difficult to track, tax, and organize. Empires prefer flat land, open terrain, and visible populations. They need space that can be measured, counted, and controlled. An empire needs to see its people in order to rule them. Before empires expanded outward, they almost always did something else first. They built a center. A center isn't just a city. It's a concentration of storage, administration, religion, and authority. Granaries, temples, palaces, and record systems appear together for a reason. Once a center exists, everything around it becomes the periphery. Taxes flow inward. Orders flow outward. At that moment, power becomes directional. And that's when an empire becomes visible on the map. What's striking is how consistent this pattern remains across centuries. Names change, languages change, leaders change. But the places where empires emerge remain surprisingly familiar. Geography doesn't change easily. Human ambition does, but opportunity doesn't. History doesn't repeat itself. Conditions repeat. And whenever those conditions align again, power reorganizes itself in familiar ways. Understanding this changes how you see the past. Empires are no longer mysterious or inevitable. They are responses to specific environments. They are systems built on surplus, predictability, and control. Once those foundations exist, expansion becomes possible. And once expansion begins, it rarely stops by choice. In the next episode, we'll move away from geography and look at something even more dangerous: how the first empires actually ruled. Not just through violence, but through systems far more subtle and effective. Because building power is difficult, but maintaining power is far more complex. This isn't a story about empires. It's a story about what humans do once they have power. And this story is still unfolding.